What happens when a brilliant young doctor criticizes exactly the man who could change her life forever, without knowing he's standing right behind her? Eloise Carter thought she was just venting about another cold surgeon. She had no idea that Dr. Alexander Bennett was hearing every single word. In that elevator, somewhere between the 7th and 8th floors of St. Jude Medical Center, something shifted. A spark ignited. And what started as professional rivalry would soon become something neither of them could control. But what happened next, no one there could have imagined. If this story touches you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening to this from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. The aroma of cold coffee and hospital disinfectant hung in the air as Eloise Carter pushed through the glass doors of St. Jude Medical Center for the first time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her pristine white coat, still carrying that new smell. Boston welcomed her with a gray March sky, but inside her, the sun blazed with the intensity of dreams she'd carried for years. Finally, she whispered to herself, watching the frantic movement in the lobby. Nurses walked with hurried steps, doctors flipped through charts while talking on phones, and the constant sound of medical equipment created a familiar symphony that warmed her heart. This was the place she'd always dreamed of being. The elevator doors opened with a gentle ding, revealing two nurses having a quiet conversation. Eloise stepped in, pressing the button for the 10th floor, where the cardiovascular surgery department was located. Her hands were still shaking, a mix of nerves and pure adrenaline. "Did you see how he treated the new resident yesterday?" murmured the older nurse, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes. Dr. Bennett nearly made her cry in front of everyone. The name echoed in Eloise's mind like an alarm bell. Dr. Alexander Bennett, the legendary chief surgeon she'd studied obsessively for months, whose innovative techniques were discussed at every medical conference she'd attended. "He's brilliant, but what a cold man," sighed the younger nurse, shaking her head. 15 years working here and I've never seen him smile. Not once." Eloise felt a stab of irritation rise in her throat. Her whole life, she'd encountered men like that, doctors who hid behind a mask of superiority, as if coldness were synonymous with competence. Without thinking twice, the words escaped her lips. "He's probably just another one of those surgeons who confuse arrogance with excellence. I bet all that coldness is just a pathetic way to hide his fear of showing that he's human too, just like the rest of us." The silence that followed was deafening. The two nurses exchanged looks of pure terror, and Eloise felt an icy chill run down her spine. Slowly, she turned around. There he was. Dr. Alexander Bennett stood in the corner of the elevator like a marble statue, wearing an impeccable white coat over a navy blue shirt that brought out his storm-colored eyes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated a quiet authority that made the air feel thicker. But it was his eyes that left her breathless, not because of their beauty, but because of the intensity with which they watched her. "Interesting theory, Doctor." His voice was deep, controlled, each word measured with surgical precision. There was no apparent anger, just a cold curiosity that was somehow even more intimidating. "Carter. Eloise Carter." She lifted her chin, determined not to show the nervousness consuming her inside. "And it's not a theory. It's an observation based on experience." The corner of Alexander's mouth curved into something that might be called a smile, if it weren't so devoid of warmth. "Experience? At 26 years old?" 27, she corrected, feeling her blood boil. "And yes, enough experience to recognize when someone uses fear as a defense mechanism." The nurses practically shrank against the elevator wall, exchanging desperate glances. The air was so tense, it seemed possible to cut it with a scalpel. Alexander took a step toward her, and Eloise could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, something understated, masculine, that perfectly matched his commanding presence. The distance between them shrank, but she didn't back down an inch. "And you, Doctor?" "Carter," he said, his voice low like a whisper only she could hear. "Do you use impulsiveness as a compensation mechanism for your own insecurity?" The question hit like a punch to the stomach, but Eloise kept her gaze steady. "I'd take honest impulsiveness over calculated coldness any day." The elevator stopped at the 8th floor, with a barely perceptible jolt. The doors opened, and the two nurses practically ran out, mumbling apologies as they disappeared down the hallway. Now it was just the two of them. Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were a particularly complex clinical case. "You know, Dr. Carter, there's a very fine line between confidence and arrogance. Be careful not to cross it on your first day." "Thanks for the advice," she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'd rather risk authenticity than live hiding behind a mask of ice." The 10th floor arrived with another gentle ding. The doors opened to reveal the busy hallway of the surgery department. Alexander stepped out first, but stopped in the doorway, turning to face her one last time. "Welcome to St. Jude, Dr. Carter." His voice carried a note she couldn't decipher, challenge, amusement, or perhaps something deeper. "I hope your authenticity proves as impressive as your sharp tongue." Eloise stepped out of the elevator with slightly shaky legs, but maintaining her upright posture. When she turned to respond, he had already disappeared down the hallway, leaving only the echo of his firm footsteps and the lingering scent of his cologne. "My God," murmured a voice behind her. "Did you just argue with Dr. Alexander Bennett on your first day?" Eloise turned to find a red-haired resident with a shocked expression. "Arguing would be too strong a word," she replied, trying to sound casual while her heart still beat erratically. "He never talks to new residents. Never. And you managed to irritate him in less than 5 minutes." The redhead shook her head, impressed. "I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Mitchell." "Eloise Carter, and I didn't irritate him," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. "I just, confronted him." Sarah let out a nervous laugh. "Confronted. Dr. Bennett, in the elevator." She paused, as if still processing the information. "You're either brave or completely crazy." "Maybe a little of both," Eloise admitted, finally allowing a smile to touch her lips. As they walked down the hallway toward the surgical center, Eloise couldn't get Alexander out of her head. There was something in those stormy eyes, something behind the mask of coldness that intrigued her deeply. The way he'd studied her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "He's not just cold, you know," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "He's complicated. Lost his wife 3 years ago. Cancer. Ever since then, it's like a part of him died with her." Eloise felt an unexpected pang in her chest. Compassion, curiosity. She couldn't define exactly what it was, but something had changed in how she saw Dr. Alexander Bennett. The surgical center doors opened before them, revealing a world of precision, tension, and lives being saved every second. Eloise took a deep breath, knowing her journey there was just beginning. But as she put on her surgical scrubs, one question kept echoing in her mind. What exactly had she seen in those stormy eyes, and why couldn't she stop thinking about him? The rhythmic sound of heart monitors echoed through the hallway as Eloise joined the group of residents for the first medical rounds of the morning. The coffee she held in her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the adrenaline that always coursed through her veins when she was about to dive into medicine. "Dr. Bennett will be leading rounds today," Sarah murmured in her ear, adjusting the stethoscope around her neck. "Brace yourself. He has a habit of asking questions that leave even senior residents breaking out in a cold sweat." Eloise nodded, but inside she felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. Since their elevator encounter 3 days ago, she'd only crossed paths with Alexander in passing through the corridors. Each time he'd greet her with a formal nod, but his eyes seemed to study her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. The double doors of the surgical center opened, and Alexander entered with his usual magnetic presence. He wore an impeccable white coat over a gray shirt that brought out the stormy color of his eyes. His steps were measured, confident, and when he stopped in front of the group, silence fell instantly. "Good morning." His deep voice cut through the air like a sharp scalpel. "Today we'll visit 5 patients, and I expect you've studied the cases I sent last night." His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and Eloise felt that strange electricity run down her spine again. There was something challenging in that look, as if he were testing her resolve. The first case was straightforward, a post-operative saphenous vein graft without complications. Alexander asked basic technical questions that the more experienced residents answered easily. Eloise remained silent, observing, learning not just about medicine, but about the man behind the reputation. It was with the third patient that everything changed. Mr. Williams, 58 years old, admitted 2 days ago with chest pain and shortness of breath, Alexander read from the chart in a neutral voice. Initial tests inconclusive. Dr. Patterson, what's your assessment? The senior resident cleared his throat nervously. Probably unstable angina, Dr. Bennett. The symptoms are classic, and the EKG shows suggestive changes. Alexander nodded slowly, but Eloise noticed an almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. Something wasn't right. Dr. Carter, his voice cut through the air like lightning. First impression? All eyes turned to her. Eloise felt the weight of expectation, but walked to the patient's bedside with firm steps. Mr. Williams was a tired-looking man with slightly grayish skin and labored breathing. "May I examine you, sir?" she asked in a gentle voice, and he nodded. Eloise placed her stethoscope on the patient's chest, closing her eyes to concentrate. The breathing sound was shallow, with a subtle pattern that bothered her. Her hands felt his pulse. Too fast, too irregular to be just angina. "Mr. Williams," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "when the pain started, did it feel like something was tearing inside your chest?" The man blinked in surprise. "Yes, exactly that." "How did you know?" Eloise turned to Alexander, ignoring the confused looks from the other residents. "It's not angina, Dr. Bennett. It's subsegmental pulmonary embolism. The tearing pain, the shallow breathing, the pulse pattern, everything points to it." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Alexander remained motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach contract. Then slowly, he approached the bed and repeated the examination she had performed. "Dr. Patterson," Alexander said without taking his eyes off Eloise, "order a pulmonary CT angiogram immediately and prepare heparin." "But Dr. Bennett, the initial tests didn't show." "Now," Alexander cut him off, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. While Dr. Patterson hurried off to arrange the tests, Alexander finally looked away from Eloise, but she could see something different in his expression. Respect? Surprise? It was impossible to decipher. "How did you reach that conclusion, Dr. Carter?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "The combination of symptoms didn't add up for classic angina," she explained, feeling her confidence return. "Tearing pain is more characteristic of embolism, especially when associated with shallow breathing and irregular tachycardia. Plus, Mr. Williams mentioned on admission that he'd taken a long plane trip last week." Alexander nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, Eloise saw something that could be considered admiration in his eyes. "Excellent observation," he said, and the words sounded like a reluctant concession. Few residents would have caught those subtle details. The rest of rounds continued in a strange atmosphere. Alexander directed questions to her with increasing frequency, each one more challenging than the last. And Eloise answered confidently, feeling energized by the intellectual battle that had developed between them. "Dr. Carter, if the patient in bed 304 develops arrhythmia during surgery, what would be your first intervention?" "I'd check for hypoxia or electrolyte imbalance before considering antiarrhythmics, Dr. Bennett." "And if blood pressure drops suddenly?" "I'd rule out air embolism or tension pneumothorax before administering vasopressors." With each correct answer, she saw something shift in his expression. The initial coldness gave way to focused attention, almost predatory, as if he were hunting for every flaw in her reasoning and couldn't find any. When rounds ended, Alexander addressed the group. "Dismissed. Dr. Carter, a moment." Her heart raced, but she remained where she was while the other residents quickly dispersed, Sarah shooting her an encouraging look before disappearing down the hallway. "In 5 years of supervising residents," Alexander said, tucking the chart under his arm, "I rarely see someone with your clinical insight." "Thank you," she replied, unable to completely hide the satisfaction in her voice. "That wasn't a compliment," he shot back quickly, but there was something different in his tone. "It was an observation, and observations require follow-up." Eloise frowned. "Follow-up?" Alexander stepped closer, and she could see small lines of fatigue around his eyes, details that the coldness of his posture usually concealed. You'll be assigned to work directly with me for the next few weeks. I want to see if that intuition holds up under real pressure. Are you testing me? I'm giving you the opportunity to prove you're not just an impulsive young doctor with interesting theories. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with disturbing intensity. Or to confirm exactly that. The provocation was clear, but there was something more there, a genuine curiosity he was trying to hide under layers of professionalism. Eloise felt a wave of determination rise like a tide inside her. When do we start? Tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Emergency surgery. Alexander began to walk away, but stopped, looking over his shoulder. And Dr. Carter. Yes? Next time you decide to do a psychological analysis of someone in public, make sure no one's listening. With that, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Eloise alone with the sound of monitors and a question hammering in her mind. What exactly had she awakened in him? The day had been especially exhausting. 14 consecutive hours alongside Alexander in the surgical center, where his every movement was a lesson in precision and every look a silent test of competence. Eloise felt the muscles in her shoulders tense as she climbed the stairs of the building where she lived in Back Bay, a historic red brick building she'd chosen because it was only 20 minutes from the hospital. Her keys jingled softly as she searched for them in her bag, and the scent of lavender from the powder soap the janitor used in the hallways welcomed her like a familiar embrace. It was almost midnight, and all she wanted was a hot bath and a cup of tea. That's when she heard firm footsteps climbing the stairs behind her. Eloise didn't think much about it. The building had 12 apartments, and residents arriving late wasn't uncommon. But there was something familiar about the rhythm of those steps, the confident cadence that made her heart race for no apparent reason. She stopped in front of apartment 7B, inserting the key in the lock when the footsteps stopped too. Curious, she turned slightly and felt the world stop. There was Alexander Bennett, holding a brown leather briefcase and looking at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something she couldn't define. He wore a dark wool coat over a simple t-shirt, and without the hospital coat he seemed more human, more approachable. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice sounding different in the intimate silence of the hallway, less formal, more surprised. "Dr. Bennett," she replied, feeling a blush rise up her neck. "You live here?" Alexander pointed to the door right next to hers. 7A, for 3 years. The silence that followed was charged with strange tension. They stared at each other for a few seconds, and Eloise noticed details she'd never seen before. How his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it during the day. The small, barely perceptible scar on his left eyebrow. The subtle fatigue around his eyes that the soft hallway light revealed. "What a coincidence," she murmured, finally turning the key in the lock. "Or irony of fate," he replied, and there was a note of dry humor in his voice that made her look at him again. "Sorry, did you say irony?" Alexander paused with his key in his own lock, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw the ghost of a real smile touching his lips. "A resident who called me cold and calculating on her first day ends up living 3 feet away. If that's not irony—" "I didn't call you cold," Eloise protested, feeling an unexpected wave of amusement. "I said you probably hide emotions out of fear." "Ah, much better," he said, and this time the smile was real, completely transforming his expression. "Much more flattering." Eloise laughed, a genuine sound that echoed softly through the hallway. "Can I ask how long you'd been in the elevator that day?" "Since the ground floor," Alexander admitted, leaning casually against his door. "I heard the entire conversation about my reputation. Impressive." "Oh God!" Eloise covered her face with her hands, feeling blood rush to her cheeks. "You must have thought I was a horrible person." "I thought you were brave," he said simply, and the brutal honesty of the statement made her look at him again. "Stupid, maybe, but brave." "Thank you, I think." They laughed together, and Eloise realized how different the sound of his laughter was from what she'd imagined. Deeper, warmer, more human. "Has your first month been challenging?" Alexander asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice that surprised her. "Intense," she admitted. "But good. You're a demanding teacher. But fair." "Demanding," he repeated, as if testing the word. Interesting choice. Would you prefer impossible to please? She teased and saw his eyes sparkle with amusement. I prefer thorough, he replied, but I can accept demanding. The aroma of Italian food was coming from her apartment. She'd left tomato sauce simmering on low heat before leaving that morning. Alexander seemed to notice it too, his nostrils flaring slightly. Smells good, he commented. My grandmother's tomato sauce, Eloise explained, then hesitated. The words came out before she could censor them. Have you had dinner? Alexander looked genuinely surprised by the question. No, I usually order something for delivery. Every night? Most nights, he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. Cooking for one never seemed efficient. Eloise felt an unexpected pang of sadness. She imagined him eating alone, night after night, in an empty apartment. The sauce makes enough for 4 people. It would be a waste to throw it away. Alexander stood still, studying her with that disturbing intensity. Are you inviting me to dinner? I'm offering home-cooked food to a neighbor who apparently lives on takeout, she corrected, trying to sound casual while her heart beat rapidly. Nothing more. Nothing more, he repeated, but there was something in his voice that suggested they both knew it wasn't quite like that. Of course, if you'd prefer your usual delivery. No, he said quickly, almost cutting off her words. I mean, it would be nice. 5 minutes later, Alexander was sitting at Eloise's small dining table, watching her reheat the sauce while she boiled water for pasta. He'd taken off his coat, revealing the simple t-shirt that subtly outlined the muscles of his shoulders. Without the lab coat and hospital authority, he seemed younger, more approachable. Do you always cook? He asked, watching her season the sauce with natural, confident movements. My grandmother taught me, Eloise replied, stirring the sauce with a wooden spoon. She used to say that food made with love tastes different. And you believe that? Eloise paused, looking at him over her shoulder. Don't you? Alexander was silent for a moment, his eyes lost somewhere distant. I used to believe it, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. There was a vulnerability in those words that made Eloise's heart tighten. She turned completely to face him and saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes, pain, pure and raw. What changed? She asked gently. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal battle happening behind those stormy eyes. Finally, he looked away. Life, he said simply. Eloise didn't press. Instead, she served dinner in silence, placing the plate before him carefully. They ate while talking about medical cases, surgical techniques, and slowly the tension began to dissipate. This is incredible, Alexander said after a few bites, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. Thank you. You seem different here, outside the hospital. Different how? More, she searched for the right word. Real. Alexander paused with his fork in the air, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Real, he repeated slowly. At the hospital. You're Dr. Bennett. Ultimate authority, professional coldness. Here you're just Alexander. His name sounded different when she said it, more intimate, more personal. Alexander put his fork on his plate and looked directly at her. It's been a long time since anyone called me just Alexander, he said, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't identify. Maybe it's time someone reminded you who you are underneath the lab coat, she replied boldly. They stared at each other across the table, and Eloise felt that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just doctor and resident. They were a man and a woman, neighbors, discovering that perhaps they had more in common than they'd imagined. Alexander was the first to break eye contact, looking at his watch. It's past midnight, I should go. Of course, Eloise said, trying to hide her disappointment. He stood up, grabbed his coat, but hesitated at the door. Eloise. It was the first time he'd said her name, and the sound came from his lips like a caress. Yes? Thank you. For the food. And for the company. When the door closed behind him, Eloise remained motionless, still feeling the echo of her name in his voice. On the other side of the wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of him moving through his apartment, and for the first time, Alexander Bennett no longer seemed like an unreachable stranger. But what this meant for both of them was yet to be discovered. 2 weeks had passed since the first night they'd had dinner together, and what started as a casual encounter had become a silent tradition. 3 times a week, Alexander would appear at her door at 8 o'clock, always with an excuse. A medical article to discuss, a complex case to review, or simply the reluctant admission that he'd forgotten to eat again. That Friday, Eloise decided it was time to switch roles. "You never cook for me," she said, standing in front of door 7A with 2 grocery bags in her arms. "Today I'm teaching you." Alexander opened the door already, wearing a casual t-shirt and dark jeans, a sight that still surprised her after seeing him so many days in his pristine lab coat. His hair was slightly messy, as if he'd run his hands through it while reading, and there was an open book on the coffee table behind him. "You want me to cook?" he asked, sounding genuinely puzzled. "I want you to learn to live a little," she replied, gently pushing him into the apartment. "And that includes making real food." Alexander's apartment was a surprise. She'd expected something cold and minimalist, but found a welcoming space with shelves full of books, old photographs in silver frames, and decoration that spoke of refined but personal taste. Everything was impeccably organized, but there were subtle signs of life being lived. A half-finished cup of coffee on the table, reading glasses forgotten on a medical journal, a blanket casually thrown on the couch. "Your kitchen is bigger than mine," Eloise observed, setting the bags on the dark granite counter, "and apparently never been used." "I make coffee," Alexander defended himself, following her to the kitchen with an expression somewhere between amused and apprehensive. "Coffee doesn't count." She began taking ingredients out of the bags. "Today you're going to learn to make mushroom risotto. It's impossible to mess up." "Famous last words," he muttered, but Eloise could see genuine curiosity in his eyes. The first attempt was an adorable disaster. Alexander treated each ingredient as if he were performing precision surgery, measuring and remeasuring each quantity with the meticulousness of a scientist. "You're not operating on a heart, Alexander," Eloise laughed, watching him cut mushrooms with intense concentration. "It's just food. Food that could kill me if I do it wrong," he replied, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The only way you'd die making risotto is if you fell into the pot," she teased, moving closer to guide his hands. "Like this." When her fingers touched his to show the correct movement for stirring the rice, they both froze. The contact was simple, innocent, but the electricity that ran between them was undeniable. Eloise could feel the warmth of his skin, the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with the homey smell of the kitchen. "That's better," she said, her voice coming out huskier than intended. Alexander didn't respond, but she felt his muscles tense under her touch. When he turned slightly to look at her, their faces were dangerously close. For a moment that seemed eternal, they stared at each other, and Eloise could see something burning and conflicted in his eyes. "Eloise," he whispered, his voice carrying a gentle warning. "What?" she asked, not pulling away. "This is complicated. Why does it have to be complicated?" She studied every detail of his face, the subtle lines around his eyes, the small scar on his eyebrow, the way his lips curved when he was thinking. Alexander didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. Instead, his hands found her waist, a hesitant touch as if he were testing his own limits. The risotto sizzled in the pan, reminding them where they were. "Dinner," Eloise murmured, but made no move to step away. "Can wait," Alexander said, his voice deeper than normal. They ended up burning the first batch. "My fault," Eloise said, trying to salvage what remained of the rice stuck to the bottom of the pan. "I distracted you." "You always distract me," Alexander admitted, getting a second pan from the cabinet. "It's a constant problem." "Problem?" He paused, looking at her with an expression that mixed frustration and something deeper. "You don't understand the effect you have on me, do you?" Eloise's heart raced. "What effect?" "You make me forget all the rules I've set for my life," he said, starting to prepare a new batch of ingredients. "All the barriers I've built." "Maybe it's time to break some rules," she suggested gently. "Rules exist for a reason, Eloise." "And what reason is that?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, his movements becoming more tense. "To keep people from getting hurt." There was deep pain in those words, an old wound that Eloise could feel even without fully understanding. She approached him again, gently touching his arm. Not every intimacy ends in pain, she said. Mine always has. The confession came out as a whisper, and Eloise felt her heart tighten. Without thinking, she positioned herself in front of him, forcing him to look at her. You don't have to live like that forever. Alexander stared at her with an intensity that made the air feel thicker. His hands found her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with a gentleness that contrasted with the tension in his body. You have no idea what you're asking for, he murmured. Then show me, she challenged, her voice barely above a whisper. The second attempt at risotto was forgotten in the pan. Alexander leaned down slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, as if giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Eloise didn't want to pull away. She wanted to move closer, wanted to feel what was in those stormy eyes that drew her like a magnet. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them. Eloise could feel his masculine scent intensify, the heat of his body radiating through his thin t-shirt. Her fingers buried lightly in his dark hair, and she felt him tremble under her touch. Eloise, he said again, but this time it wasn't a warning, it was a plea. I know, she whispered, her lips almost touching his. The world narrowed to that moment, to that microscopic space between them where everything was possible. Alexander tilted his head closer, his lips barely brushing hers in a promise of a kiss that set every nerve ending in Eloise on fire. And then, abruptly, he pulled away. I can't, he said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. I can't do this to you. Eloise stood where she was, still feeling the ghost of the almost kiss on her lips. Why? Because you deserve more than I can give, he said, turning to the pan and stirring the risotto with jerky movements. You deserve someone who isn't what? Broken. The word came out like a confession torn by force, and Eloise felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness, but from a more complex emotion, a mixture of compassion, frustration, and something dangerously close to love. Alexander, she approached him from behind, her voice soft as silk. Who said you're broken? He didn't answer, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as he stirred the rice. Everyone has scars, she continued. That doesn't make us broken. It makes us human. Alexander turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw an epic battle taking place. Desire fighting against fear, hope against despair. You don't understand, he said, his voice heavy with old pain. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am anymore. Then let me remind you, she said boldly. For a moment it seemed like he would give in. His eyes softened, and she saw the man behind the mask, vulnerable, scared, but desperately wanting to believe that it was still possible to be happy. But then the mask reformed. The risotto is ready, he said, his voice regaining its professional coldness. We should eat before it gets cold. Eloise knew the moment had passed, but she also knew that something irreversible had happened between them. They had crossed a line even though they hadn't kissed, and now there was no more pretending they were just neighbors. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts but aware of each other's every movement. When Alexander finally got up to leave, he stopped at the door. Thank you, he said without turning around, for trying. And when the door closed behind him, Eloise knew their lives would never be the same again. The surgical center had never felt so charged with electricity. Every morning when Eloise entered for medical rounds, she could sense Alexander's presence before even seeing him, as if her body had developed a special radar to detect him. And when their eyes finally met across the room, crowded with doctors and nurses, the world around them seemed to disappear for a few precious seconds. It had been like this all week following that night in his kitchen. Dr. Bennett has been different lately, Sarah commented as they prepared for another surgery. Less glacial. Have you noticed? Eloise pretended to be focused on adjusting her surgical mask, but felt a blush rising up her neck. Different how? I don't know. More human? Sarah tilted her head, thoughtful. Yesterday he actually smiled when Dr. Patterson dropped some instruments. Smiled, Eloise. The Iceman smiled. At that moment, as if summoned by their conversation, Alexander entered the prep room. His eyes found Eloise's immediately, and she felt that now familiar flutter in her stomach. He wore the surgical cap that hid his dark hair, but nothing could disguise the intensity of his gaze. "Good morning, team," he said, his professional voice echoing through the room. "We have a complex surgery ahead, aortic aneurysm with type A dissection." Eloise took a deep breath. It was the kind of surgery she'd studied obsessively, but had never witnessed live. Her hands trembled slightly as she finished her preparations. "Dr. Carter," Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts, "you'll be at my right side during the procedure." First assistant position. She felt the surprised looks from the other residents. Usually that position was reserved for more experienced doctors. Sarah's eyes widened, making a wow expression behind her mask. "Yes, Doctor." "Bennett," Eloise replied, trying to sound professional while her heart raced. In the operating room, the tension was palpable. The patient, a man in his early 50s, was under general anesthesia, and the monitors showed vital signs that were stable but concerning. A single wrong move could be fatal. "Scalpel," Alexander said, extending his hand. Eloise placed the instrument in his palm, and when their fingers touched for a second through the surgical gloves, she felt an electric shock run up her arm. Alexander seemed to feel it too, because his eyes met hers above his mask. "Focus," he murmured. But there was something in his voice that suggested the reminder was more for himself. The next 4 hours were a delicate dance of medical precision and mutual awareness. Eloise anticipated Alexander's every move, handing him instruments before he even asked for them, absorbing every word of guidance as if they were intimate whispers. There was a synchronicity between them that went beyond medicine, as if their bodies and minds were in perfect harmony. "Suction," Alexander said when a small hemorrhage obscured his vision. Eloise's hand was already moving before he finished the word. Their arms crossed for a moment as she worked, and through the surgical gowns she could feel the warmth of his body. "Perfect," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. He wasn't talking about the procedure. When the surgery finally ended successfully, the team left the room in small groups, chatting excitedly about the complexity of the case. Eloise stayed behind to help with cleanup, but she was really looking for a reason to spend a few more minutes near Alexander. "Beautiful work today," he said when they were alone, removing his surgical gloves with careful movements. "I learned from the best," she replied, taking off her own mask and feeling the relief of fresh air on her face. Alexander stopped what he was doing and looked directly at her. Without the mask, she could see the complete expression on his face, a mixture of pride, desire, and something that seemed dangerously close to tenderness. "You have a natural talent," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's rare to find someone who understands the dance of surgery so intuitively." "The dance?" "That's what it is," he explained, moving closer to her as they put away instruments. "A perfect choreography between two partners who trust each other completely." The word partners hung in the air between them, loaded with multiple meanings. Eloise felt her heart speed up when she realized Alexander had positioned himself closer to her than necessary. "Trust," she repeated. "Is that what we felt in there?" "Among other things," he admitted, his eyes fixing on her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "What other things?" Alexander fell silent, but the answer was written in every line of tension in his body, in every controlled breath, in the way his fists clenched and opened as if he were fighting against an irresistible impulse. "Alexander," she said softly, taking a step toward him, "you can't keep pretending you don't feel what's happening between us." "I can, and I will," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why?" "Because I'm your supervisor," he said, starting to pull away. "Because you're my resident. Because there's an ethical code that—" "Ethical code?" Eloise couldn't hide the irritation in her voice, or fear of allowing yourself to feel something real. Alexander stopped abruptly, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with contained emotion. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," she shot back, moving closer again. "I know that when we're operating together, you forget all those rules. I know that when you look at me, you're not seeing a resident. And I know you're so afraid of getting hurt again that you'd rather hide behind hospital protocols." "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "I won't stop," she continued, driven by desperate courage. "Because every time you look at me, I see the real man underneath that armor, and he's begging to be set free. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the epic war happening in his eyes. Finally, he took a step toward her, almost completely eliminating the distance between them. "You want to know the truth," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The truth is, I can't stop thinking about you. During surgeries, during meetings, during sleepless nights, you're in my head like a song I can't get out." Eloise's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "And that's bad." "It's terrible," he admitted, "because every time I start to believe that maybe it's possible to feel something again, I remember what it's like to lose someone you love." "Your wife," Eloise said softly. Alexander closed his eyes, as if the name were physical pain. "Emma. She died in my arms, and I promised myself I'd never let anyone get that close again." "But you are letting someone," Eloise whispered. "You already have." When Alexander opened his eyes, there were unshed tears shining in them. "I know, and it terrifies me." They stood there in the center of the empty operating room, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the memory of lives saved together. The distance between them was small enough that she could count every eyelash, every expression line, every nuance of emotion he tried to hide. "Eloise," he whispered, raising his hand as if to touch her face, but stopping in the air. "Yes? Us can't happen." "Why not?" "Because when it happens," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity, "it won't be something I can control. And control is all I have left." With that, he left the room, leaving Eloise alone with the echo of his words and the absolute certainty that, control or no control, they were walking inexorably towards something that would change everything. But what she didn't know was that outside the room, Alexander was leaning against the wall, fighting the urge to go back and break all the rules he himself had created once and for all. 3 days had passed since the conversation in the operating room, and Alexander was avoiding her. Not obviously, he still greeted her professionally during rounds, still asked technical questions during procedures, but there was a deliberate coldness in their interactions, a calculated distance that hurt more than Eloise wanted to admit. It was as if he'd erected a glass wall between them. She could see him clearly, but could no longer reach him. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, finding her alone in the break room at 10 p.m. "You seem distant." "Just tired," Eloise lied, absently stirring the cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Long surgery hours." Sarah sat down beside her, studying her expression. "Are you sure that's all? Because Dr. Bennett also seems strange, more tense than usual, if that's even possible." Eloise didn't respond, but felt the weight of Sarah's observation like a stone in her stomach. Alexander was tense. She'd noticed how he clenched his fists during surgeries, how his shoulders remained rigid even when procedures went well. "Eloise," Sarah lowered her voice, "did something happen between you two?" "Nothing happened," Eloise said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "There's nothing between us." But the words sounded hollow even to herself. Midnight found Eloise standing in front of door 7A, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest. She'd spent 2 hours debating with herself, pacing back and forth in her apartment, trying to find the courage to do what she knew needed to be done. They couldn't continue like this, pretending nothing had changed, dancing around feelings that were becoming more intense each day. If Alexander wanted distance, she needed to know why. If he wanted to end them before they even began, she deserved to hear it from him directly. She knocked on the door with 3 firm raps. The sound of footsteps approached slowly, and when the door opened, Alexander appeared wearing only a white t-shirt and dark pajama pants. His hair was disheveled, as if he'd been sleeping poorly, and there was genuine surprise on his face. "Eloise, it's almost midnight, I know." She took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she possessed. "Can I come in? We need to talk." Alexander hesitated, his eyes scanning the empty hallway as if checking whether anyone was watching them. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The apartment was bathed in cozy, dim light, illuminated only by the soft glow of a lamp in the corner of the room. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table next to a glass that still contained a finger of the golden liquid. "You were drinking," she observed. "1 glass," he admitted, closing the door behind her. "To sleep." but she could tell by the way he moved, by the slight tremor in his hands, that sleeping hadn't been working for days. "Alexander," she said, turning to face him, "I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I'm feeling." He went completely still, as if she'd just dropped a bomb in the middle of the room. "Eloise." "No," she raised her hand, stopping him from speaking. "Let me finish, because if I don't say this now, I'll go crazy." Alexander leaned against the closed door, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of panic and resignation. "I'm in love with you," she said, the words coming out like a confession torn from the depths of her soul. "Desperately, completely in love. And I know you feel something too, because I see it in your eyes every time you look at me." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander remained leaning against the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, clearly fighting some epic internal battle. "You can't say that," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Why not? Because it's true. Because it can't work," he exploded, pushing away from the door and starting to pace around the room. "Because you're my resident, because I'm your supervisor, because there are rules." "Forget the rules for a second," she interrupted, following him. "Forget the hospital, forget all of that, just tell me what you feel." Alexander stopped abruptly, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with repressed emotion. "What I feel? Yes, I feel like I'm losing my mind," he confessed, running his hands through his hair in desperation. "I feel like you've turned my world upside down in less than a month. I feel like when you look at me, all the defenses I've built over the last 3 years crumble like a house of cards." Eloise felt tears of relief burn her eyes. "Then why are you running from me?" "Because I'm going to hurt you," he said, his voice heavy with deep pain. "That's what I do, Eloise. I hurt the people I love." "You didn't hurt Emma." "I couldn't save her," he cut her off, the words coming out like a confession torn by force. "I'm one of the best cardiovascular surgeons in the country, and I couldn't save the only person who really mattered." Eloise felt her heart break for him. "Alexander, her cancer wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" He laughed bitterly. "I spent so much time focused on my career, on building my reputation, that by the time I finally realized she was sick, it was too late. And you think that by pushing everyone away, living like an emotional hermit, you'll bring her back?" Alexander's eyes flared. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Eloise said, approaching him with determination. "You feel guilty for being alive, guilty for still being capable of feeling something, guilty for wanting me. Stop." "I won't stop," she continued, stopping right in front of him, "because Emma wouldn't want this for you. She wouldn't want you to punish yourself for the rest of your life." "You can't talk about her," Alexander said, his voice dangerously low. "I can and I will, because someone has to," Eloise replied boldly. "She loved you, didn't she? Then she would want you to be happy. She would want you to live, not just exist." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the tears he refused to shed shining in his eyes. Slowly he raised his hands and touched her face, as he had done in the kitchen. "You have no idea how guilty I feel for wanting you," he whispered. "Then stop feeling guilty," she said, covering his hands with hers, "and let me love you." For a moment, it seemed like he would give in. His eyes softened, and she saw the vulnerable man behind all the pain. But then, as if a curtain had fallen, his expression hardened again. "I can't," he said, pulling his hands away from her face as if the touch burned. "I won't drag you into my darkness. What if I want to be there?" "You don't," he said with a certainty that irritated her deeply. "You deserve someone who isn't an emotional ghost." "Let me decide what I deserve," Eloise said, her voice rising. "I've decided for both of us," Alexander replied, moving toward the door. "This ends here, Eloise. There can't be any more." "This." "This?" She gestured between them. "I can't even name what you feel." "There's nothing to name," he lied, but avoided looking directly at her. Anger and frustration exploded inside Eloise like a broken dam. "You're a coward," she said, the words coming out like sharp blades. Alexander stopped with his hand on the doorknob, his shoulders tensing. "That's right," she continued, driven by pain and disappointment. "A coward who hides behind rules and ethical codes because he's afraid to admit he's still capable of loving someone." Emma must be rolling in her grave seeing what you've become. Alexander turned slowly, and the expression on his face was one of pure anguish. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Gladly," Eloise shot back, walking toward the door with her chin up and tears burning her eyes. "But when you get tired of living like a ghost, when you get tired of wasting the life that Emma would have given anything to have back, you know where to find me." She slammed the door behind her hard enough to make the pictures on the wall tremble. On the other side of the door, Alexander collapsed against the wood, closing his eyes and trying to control the storm of emotions that threatened to destroy him. Eloise's words echoed in his mind like painful echoes of the truth, but some truths, he thought, were too dangerous to face, even when his heart was begging to prove her wrong. A week had passed since the devastating argument in Alexander's apartment. A week of icy silences in the hallways, of avoided glances during medical rounds, of a professional coldness that cut through the air like a sharp blade every time they had to work together. Eloise had thrown herself into work with an almost self-destructive intensity, volunteering for double shifts and studying until the early hours to avoid the torturous silence of her apartment. She knew Alexander was on the other side of the wall, could hear his restless footsteps during the early morning hours, but the distance between them now seemed like an unbridgeable chasm. It was on a grey Tuesday that everything changed. The emergency alarm echoed through the hospital corridors at 3 in the morning, a shrill sound that made all the on-call doctors run toward the emergency room. Eloise was finishing a report when she heard the paramedics' shouts as they arrived. "Male, 34 years old, serious car accident, multiple chest trauma, possible aortic rupture." Her blood ran cold. Aortic rupture was one of the most critical emergencies that existed. Minutes, sometimes seconds, meant the difference between life and death. She ran to the trauma room and arrived at the same moment as Alexander. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and all the coldness from the previous week evaporated instantly. There was only a brilliant doctor and his best assistant, facing together the possibility of losing a life. "What do we have?" Alexander asked, already putting on surgical gloves as he approached the gurney. "James Morrison, 34 years old," reported the breathless paramedic. "High-speed head-on collision, blood pressure dropping rapidly, unstable vital signs. Suspected hemothorax and possible aortic dissection." Eloise looked at the patient and felt her stomach contract. He was a young man, probably her age, with a wedding ring that gleamed under the emergency room lights. There was blood on his torn shirt, and his breathing was labored and irregular. "I need a CT scan now," Alexander said, his hands already examining the patient's chest with precise movements. "And prep the OR. Dr. Carter, you're with me." It wasn't a question. And for the first time in a week, Eloise felt grateful that he was taking control. The next 20 minutes were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The CT scan confirmed their worst fears: type A aortic dissection with massive internal hemorrhaging. The kind of case that killed within minutes if not treated immediately. "Time since arrival?" Alexander asked as they ran to the operating room. 15 minutes since arrival," Eloise replied, checking her watch. "Blood pressure dropping to 70/40. "We don't have time for full anesthesia," Alexander said, his voice tense but controlled. "We're going to have to work fast." In the operating room, the old synchronicity between them resurged, as if it had never been broken. Alexander made the incision while Eloise controlled minor bleeding, their movements working in perfect harmony despite the tension that had dominated their relationship the previous week. "Suction," Alexander said, and Eloise's hand was already moving before he finished the word. "Vascular clamp," she anticipated, passing the instrument at the exact moment he extended his hand. It was as if the crisis had erased all resentments and fears, leaving only the essence of what they were together. An exceptional medical team that functioned like two halves of a single brain. "Hemorrhage controlled," Alexander announced after 20 minutes of intense work. "Now comes the delicate part." Eloise knew exactly what he meant. Repairing the aortic dissection required millimeter precision. One wrong move, one poorly placed stitch, and they would lose the patient. 4-0 polypropylene suture, Alexander said, extending his hand. She placed the suture in his palm, and when their fingers touched through the gloves, they both felt that familiar electric current. This time, neither pulled away. "Do you trust me?" Alexander asked suddenly, his eyes meeting hers above his mask. "With my life," she replied without hesitation. "Then help me save his." The next 2 hours were the most intense of Eloise's professional life. They worked as if they were extensions of each other, every movement calculated, every decision made together. When the patient's blood pressure plummeted dangerously, it was Eloise who suggested the technique modification that stabilized the situation. When a smaller blood vessel began bleeding unexpectedly, it was Alexander who anticipated her movement and already had the clamp ready. "Blood pressure stabilizing," announced the circulating nurse. 120/80. "Regular heart rate," added the anesthesiologist. "Excellent vital signs." Alexander made the last suture stitch and stepped back slightly, his hands finally stopping their trembling. "We did it," he said, and there was a mixture of relief and admiration in his voice. "We did it," Eloise corrected, looking at him with eyes bright with tears of relief. When the team began transporting the patient to the ICU, Alexander and Eloise were left alone in the operating room. The silence was different now, no longer charged with anger or resentment, but with deep mutual understanding. "Eloise," Alexander said, slowly removing his surgical gloves. "About what happened?" "You don't need to apologize," she interrupted, taking off her own mask. "I understand." "No, you don't understand," he said, moving closer to her. "What happened here today, the way we worked together, that's what I fear most." "Our teamwork? Our connection," he corrected, his voice low and intense. "The way you know me better than I know myself sometimes. The way we anticipate each other's movements, it's frightening." Eloise studied his expression, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "Why frightening?" "Because that's exactly how I felt with Emma," he admitted. "That perfect synchronization, that feeling of having found my other half. And when I lost her—" "But you didn't lose it," Eloise said softly. "She's still here, in the good memories, in the love you shared. And that doesn't diminish just because you're capable of loving someone else." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the epic battle happening in his eyes. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is simple," she said, taking a step closer. "Maybe we complicate things because we're afraid to be happy." He raised his hand, almost touching her face, but stopped in the air. "Eloise, Dr. Bennett?" Sarah's voice at the door made them step apart quickly. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a problem." Alexander immediately composed himself, returning to professional mode. "What kind of problem?" Sarah looked nervously between them. "It's about Dr. Carter. Dr. Whitmore wants to see her in his office. Now." Eloise felt the blood drain from her face. Dr. Charles Whitmore was the hospital's medical director, and a summons at 5 in the morning was never good news. "Any idea why?" Alexander asked, and Eloise could detect genuine concern in his voice. Sarah hesitated. "Something about residency transfer." The words hit Eloise like a punch to the stomach. Transfer. Someone had noticed the tension between her and Alexander, or worse, someone had reported inappropriate behavior. "I'll go with you," Alexander said immediately. "No," Eloise replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "He wants to talk to me." She left the room with firm steps, but inside she felt as if her world was crumbling. She had just saved a life alongside the man she loved, had discovered that maybe there was still hope for them, and now everything could be coming to an end before it had even begun. And as she walked through the empty corridors toward Whitmore's office, one question hammered in her mind. What exactly had motivated this summons? And more importantly, would Alexander be able to fight for her, or would he let her go without a word? Dr. Charles Whitmore's office smelled of strong coffee and polished wood when Eloise knocked on the door at 5:15 in the morning. Her fingers still trembled slightly, not from the exhaustion of surgery, but from the anxiety that gnawed at her stomach, since Sarah had mentioned the word transfer. "Come in," said the medical director's authoritative voice. Dr. Whitmore was a man in his 60s, with graying hair and penetrating eyes that had witnessed decades of hospital dramas. He sat behind an imposing mahogany desk with an open folder in front of him and an expression that Eloise couldn't decipher. "Have a seat, Doctor." "Carter," he said, gesturing to the leather chair in front of the desk. Eloise sat down, maintaining her upright posture, despite the nervousness that made her heart beat erratically. "Dr. Whitmore, if this is about—" "We received an interesting request last night," he interrupted, flipping through the papers in the folder. "A residency transfer request, signed by you." Eloise's world stopped. "I didn't sign any transfer request." "Doctor." Whitmore raised an eyebrow, studying her with renewed attention. "You didn't? How curious, because here it is with your signature requesting a transfer to Massachusetts General Hospital." Eloise leaned forward, studying the paper he turned toward her. It really was her signature, or a very good imitation, but she had never filled out that form. "Dr. Whitmore, I don't know how this happened, but I never—" The office door burst open abruptly, and Alexander entered without knocking. His hair was disheveled. He still wore surgical scrubs, and there was an expression of pure desperation on his face. "Charles," he said, completely ignoring protocol, "I need to talk to you, now." Dr. Whitmore looked between them with an expression that mixed surprise and what seemed like amusement. "Dr. Bennett, I'm in the middle of a meeting." "It's about the transfer," Alexander said, his voice loaded with urgency. "It was me. I forged the request." The silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Eloise stared at Alexander with a mixture of shock and betrayal, while Dr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "You forged a resident's signature?" Whitmore asked slowly. "Yes," Alexander admitted, his hands trembling slightly. "And I came here to withdraw the request and accept the consequences." "Alexander," Eloise whispered, her voice heavy with hurt. "How could you—" "Because I'm an idiot," he said, turning to face her directly. "Because I'm a coward who thought forcing you to leave would be easier than admitting the truth." "What truth?" Dr. Whitmore asked, clearly fascinated by the drama unfolding in his office. Alexander took a deep breath as if preparing to jump off a cliff. "That I'm hopelessly in love with Dr. Carter." The words echoed through the room like thunder. Eloise felt the world spin around her, her heart beating so hard she was sure both men could hear it. "In love," Dr. Whitmore repeated slowly. "Completely," Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength. "Irreparably. To the point where I can't concentrate on anything but her. To the point of questioning all the rules I've followed religiously throughout my entire career." Eloise stared at him, barely able to believe what she was hearing. This was the same man who a week ago had said it was impossible, who had hidden behind ethical codes and professional rules. "Dr. Bennett," Whitmore said carefully, "are you aware that relationships between supervisors and residents are prohibited?" "I know." Alexander straightened his shoulders, assuming a military posture. "That's why I'm here to resign from my position as residency supervisor." "Alexander, no," Eloise said, rising from her chair. "You can't do this." "I can and I will," he replied, looking at her with a determination she'd never seen before. "Because you were right, about everything. I am a coward who was wasting the chance to be happy out of fear of getting hurt again. Your career— My career means nothing if I don't have you to share it with," he said, taking a step toward her. "I spent the entire week trying to convince myself it would be better if you left, that it would be easier to return to my empty, controlled existence. And I discovered I'd rather live one day being truly happy with you than an entire lifetime hiding behind rules I created out of fear," he confessed, his hands finding her face. "Emma taught me what it means to love someone completely. You taught me it's possible to love again." Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat discreetly. "Well, this is touching, but we still have an administrative problem." Alexander turned to him without letting go of Eloise's face. "I'll accept any position at the hospital that allows her to finish her residency here. Attending physician, consultant, anything. Just don't force her to leave." "Alexander," Eloise touched his hands that still covered her face, "you don't need to sacrifice everything for me." "It's not a sacrifice," he said, his eyes shining with intense emotion. "It's the first thing I've done in 3 years that actually matters. Dr." Whitmore stood up from behind his desk, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital courtyard. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "In 40 years of medicine," he said finally, without turning around, "I've learned that the best doctors aren't necessarily the coldest ones. They're the ones who can balance technical competence with human compassion." He turned to face them. "Dr. Bennett, you're one of the finest surgeons who has ever worked at this hospital. Dr. Carter, your performance over the last 2 months has been exceptional, and this morning you saved a life working in perfect synchronization." Eloise held her breath, not knowing where the conversation was heading. "Therefore," Whitmore continued, "I accept your resignation from the supervisory position, Dr. Bennett, but I don't accept your departure from the hospital. You'll be transferred to the cardiothoracic surgery department as a senior attending physician, and Dr. Carter will be reassigned to a different supervisor." "That means," Eloise began. "That means you'll no longer have a direct hierarchical relationship," Whitmore explained with a discreet smile. "What you do with your personal lives, as long as it doesn't interfere with work, is your business." Alexander looked at Eloise, and she saw pure hope shining in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. "There's one condition," Whitmore added, returning to his desk. "No public displays of affection in the hospital. Keep professional and personal life separate, at least during work hours." "Of course," Alexander said quickly. "Absolutely. And one more thing," Whitmore smiled, picking up the transfer form. "Next time you want to resolve personal problems, do it outside my hospital. And without forging documents." Alexander had the decency to look embarrassed. "Yes, sir." When they left the office, the hallway was empty and silent. Alexander stopped, turning to Eloise with an expression that mixed relief, nervousness, and something that looked like hope. "Eloise," he said, his voice hesitant, "I know I have no right to ask this after everything I've done, but—" She moved closer to him, placing her fingers on his lips to silence him. "You were scared," she said gently. "I understand. I was terrified," he admitted. "I still am. Of what? Of not being enough for you. Of repeating the same mistakes. Of losing you like I lost her." Eloise studied his face, seeing every line of vulnerability, every shadow of old pain. "Alexander, you're not going to lose me by loving too much. You'll lose me by not trying." He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, there was a new resolution there, a determination she hadn't seen before. "Then let's try," he said, his hands finding hers. "Slowly, with fear, maybe making mistakes along the way, but let's try." "Let's try," she agreed, intertwining their fingers. And for the first time in weeks, when they separated to go home, there were no more walls between them. Just the sweet and terrifying promise of a new beginning. But what neither of them knew was that the greatest challenge of their lives was yet to come. 6 weeks had passed since that morning in Dr. Whitmore's office, and Eloise's life had transformed in ways she'd never imagined possible. Alexander was no longer just the cold, unreachable surgeon she'd met in the elevator. He'd become her partner, her confidant, the man who kissed her with infinite tenderness every morning before they left for work. But that May morning, as she stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, Eloise felt as if the world had stopped spinning. 2 pink lines. Unmistakable. "My God," she whispered, leaning against the bathroom sink in her apartment. Her legs felt like jelly, and her heart was beating so hard she could hear it echoing in the silence of the bathroom. Pregnant. She was pregnant. She looked at the clock. 7 in the morning. Alexander would arrive in 15 minutes for the breakfast they'd made routine, bringing croissants from the French bakery 2 blocks from the hospital. How could a life change completely in 15 minutes? Eloise hid the test in the dresser drawer and tried to get ready normally, but her hands were shaking so much she could barely apply mascara. In the mirror, she saw a pale, frightened woman looking back. Nothing like the confident doctor who'd fallen in love with Boston's most feared surgeon. The familiar knock at the door made her jump. "I'm here," Alexander called from the hallway, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And I brought those chocolate croissants you love." Eloise took a deep breath, trying to compose a normal expression before opening the door. Alexander was there in his favorite navy shirt, his hair still slightly damp from the shower, holding a paper bag from the bakery and 2 coffees to go. When he saw her, his smile immediately turned to concern. "You're pale," he said, setting the coffees on the table and touching her forehead with the back of his hand. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm a little nauseous," she said, and technically it wasn't a lie. "We worked too hard yesterday," Alexander murmured, wrapping her in his arms. That 10-hour surgery was brutal. You should have rested more. The scent of his cologne and the feeling of safety in his arms almost made her break down in tears. How was she going to tell him? How was she going to explain that their lives were about to change forever? "Alexander," she began, pulling back slightly to look into his eyes. "I need to tell you something." "You can tell me anything," he said, his hands gently stroking her arms. "You know that." But the words stuck in her throat. How could she destroy the delicate happiness they'd built together? How could she throw this responsibility onto a man who had fought so hard against the fear of loving again? "It's about us," she finally managed to say. Alexander's expression changed instantly, a shadow of panic crossing his eyes. "What about us? Are you wanting to break up?" "No," she exclaimed quickly. "No, Alexander, that's not it." The relief on his face was so evident it broke her heart. "Then what is it?" Eloise closed her eyes, gathering courage. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. When she opened her eyes, Alexander was completely still, as if he'd turned to stone. His expression was unreadable. There was no anger, no joy, just an emptiness that terrified her. "Pregnant," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word. "6 weeks," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know we didn't plan this. I know it's complicated with our careers. I know you might not be ready." "Stop," he said softly, raising his hand. Eloise fell silent, bracing herself for the rejection she saw forming in his eyes. He was going to say it was too soon, that they barely knew each other, that his career was priority. All the logical, rational things a man like Alexander Bennett would say. Instead, he collapsed into the nearest chair, covering his face with his hands. "Alexander," she whispered, approaching cautiously. "A baby," he murmured through his hands. "Our baby." There was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Fear, wonder, terror, joy. Maybe all of it mixed together. "Are you angry?" she asked, kneeling beside the chair. Alexander finally took his hands away from his face, and when he looked at her, there were tears shining in his eyes. "Angry? Eloise, I'm terrified." Her heart sank. "I understand if you don't want—" "That's not it," he interrupted quickly, taking her hands. "It's not that I don't want this, it's that, what if I don't know how to be a father? What if I'm as cold with our child as I am with everyone else?" The raw vulnerability in his voice brought tears to Eloise's eyes. "Alexander, you're not cold, not with me, but with a child." He shook his head. "Emma and I tried to have children for years. When she got sick, one of the things that destroyed her most was knowing she'd never be a mother." Eloise felt her heart tighten. "And now you feel guilty for having this with someone else." "I do," he admitted, tears finally escaping. "Like I'm betraying her memory." Eloise stood up, pulling him to his feet as well. "Alexander, look at me," she said firmly. "Emma wanted you to be a father. She would have been happy knowing you found someone who could give that to you." "How can you be sure?" "Because women who truly love want to see the people they love happy, even when they can't be there anymore to share that happiness," Eloise said, gently touching his face. "She loved you enough to want you to live, not just survive." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the epic battle happening in his eyes. Finally, his hands moved to her abdomen, touching it with an almost religious reverence. "Our baby," he whispered, wonder replacing fear in his voice. "Our baby," she confirmed, covering his hands with hers. Do you want this?" "With me?" The question came loaded with such pure vulnerability that it completely melted Eloise's heart. "Alexander, there's no one in the world I'd rather have a child with." He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with desperate passion, as if trying to communicate all the feelings that words couldn't express. When they separated, both were breathless. "We have to tell people at the hospital," he said, stroking her hair, "and we have to prepare for the comments." "Comments are the least of our problems," Eloise replied. "How are we going to balance 2 demanding medical careers with a baby?" "We'll figure it out together," Alexander said, and there was an iron determination in his voice she'd never heard before. "Because now it's not just about the 2 of us anymore." They spent the rest of the morning making plans, discussing possibilities, facing fears and dreaming of a future neither had imagined when they met in that tense elevator. "Hey, it's going to be a girl," Alexander said suddenly, gently caressing Eloise's still flat abdomen. "How do you know?" "Medical intuition," he joked, but there was something serious in his eyes. "And if it is, I want her to be exactly like you. Brave, intelligent, capable of confronting stubborn men and making them admit they're wrong. And if it's a boy, I'll teach him to be a better man than I was," Alexander said. "I'll teach him that loving isn't weakness, and that sometimes the best things in life come when we have the courage to break our own rules." Eloise kissed him softly, savoring the sweetness of the moment. "I think you've already learned that lesson." "I'm learning," he corrected. "Every day with you." When they finally left for the hospital, holding hands in public for the first time, Eloise knew the real challenges were just beginning. Rumors, curious looks, the pressure of balancing demanding medical careers with a family. But looking at Alexander, the man who had chosen love over fear, who had sacrificed his position of power for her, who now touched her belly as if she carried the world's greatest treasure, she knew they were ready to face anything, as long as they were together. 6 months later, Apartment 7A had been completely transformed. Where an almost monastic organization once reigned, there were now signs of shared life everywhere. Eloise's medical books mixed with Alexander's on the shelves, a second coffee cup always waiting in the kitchen, and ultrasound photos pinned to the refrigerator next to the shopping list written in her careful handwriting. Eloise was 7 months pregnant, her round belly prominent under her adapted lab coat, when Alexander came home that Tuesday in October carrying a mysterious box. "What's that?" she asked, looking up from the pediatrics book she was studying, settled on the couch with her legs propped up on pillows. "Her surprise," Alexander said, kissing her gently before kneeling beside the couch. "For our princess." He'd started referring to the baby as Princess ever since they discovered it would be a girl 3 months ago. Eloise never tired of seeing the expression of absolute tenderness that took over his face every time he talked about their daughter. "Alexander, we talked about not buying unnecessary things," she said, but she was smiling as she watched him open the box with the care of someone handling surgical instruments. "Technically, I bought it before our conversation," he replied, and the childishness in his voice made her laugh. From inside the box, he pulled out a delicate mobile of silver stars and golden moons, each piece hand-carved with meticulous details. When he shook it gently, a soft, hypnotic melody filled the apartment. "It's beautiful," Eloise whispered, feeling emotional tears prick her eyes. "Where did you find this?" "A local artisan," Alexander explained, sitting beside her and placing his hand on her round belly. "She said each star represents a dream parents have for their child." "And how many dreams do you have for her?" Eloise asked, covering his hand with hers. Alexander was silent for a moment, his eyes lost in contemplation of the mobile that spun slowly. "That she'll be brave like you," he said finally. "That she won't be afraid to confront the world when it tries to diminish her. That she'll know she's loved unconditionally. Always. And that she'll forgive me for all the times I'm going to be an overprotective and neurotic father," he admitted with an embarrassed smile. Eloise laughed, but was interrupted by a strong kick from the baby that made them both look at her belly in surprise. "I think she approves," Alexander said, his voice full of admiration. "Or she's protesting being called princess," Eloise teased. "Maybe she wants to be a doctor like her parents." "Dr. Isabella Bennett," Alexander murmured, testing the name they'd chosen. "Has a nice ring to it." Isabella had been his suggestion, a subtle tribute to Emma Isabella, his late wife, but also a new name that represented the future they were building together. Eloise had been touched by how he honored the past while embracing the present. "Remember when you said you were too broken to love anyone?" she asked, watching him assemble the mobile with delicate movements. Alexander paused, looking at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and something close to reverence. "I remember, and I was wrong about so many things." "About what specifically?" "About believing that loving again would betray Emma," he said, returning to work on the mobile. "About thinking I didn't deserve a second chance at happiness. About imagining it was better to live in the safety of solitude than risk my heart." Eloise touched his face, forcing him to look at her. "And now I know Emma wouldn't want me to waste the life she couldn't have," he said, turning his face to kiss her palm. I know love isn't a limited resource. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. It just expands my capacity to love. And about being a father? Alexander looked at her belly and his expression completely softened. Terrified, he admitted, but also more excited than I ever thought it would be possible for me to feel again. That night, while Eloise slept beside him, Alexander stayed awake looking at the ceiling, one hand resting protectively on her round belly. He could feel the baby's gentle movements, little kicks and turns that filled him with a mixture of terror and wonder. "Hi, Princess," he whispered in the dark. "I'm your daddy. I know we haven't met yet, but I'm trying to be the best man possible for you and your mommy." The baby kicked as if responding, and Alexander smiled in the darkness. "Your mommy is the bravest woman in the world," he continued. "She taught me it's not weak to be afraid. It's weak to let fear control you. I hope I can teach you that too." Eloise shifted slightly in his arms, whispering something incoherent in her sleep. Alexander kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Thank you," he whispered to Emma, wherever she was, "for letting me go, for allowing me to love again, for understanding that the heart can be big enough to hold two different loves." In the months that followed, the hospital witnessed the most unlikely transformation anyone could imagine. Dr. Alexander Bennett, known as Dr. Heartbreaker in the hallways, had become a man who arrived early at work to leave exactly on time, who carried ultrasound photos in his wallet, who smiled genuinely when someone asked about the baby. "I never thought I'd see the day," Dr. Whitmore commented to Sarah during a break between surgeries. "Alexander Bennett buying books about changing diapers." "Love changes people," Sarah replied, watching Alexander and Eloise work together in surgery through the observation room window. Even with her prominent belly limiting her movements, Eloise still assisted in Alexander's surgeries, and the synchronization between them remained perfect. "No," Whitmore corrected, smiling. "Love reveals who people really are underneath all the masks they wear." 2 weeks before Isabella's birth, Alexander found Eloise crying silently in the break room. "What's wrong?" he asked. Immediate concern stamped on his face as he knelt beside her. "What if I don't know how to be a mother?" she sobbed. "What if I'm a terrible doctor because I can't concentrate properly anymore? What if our daughter grows up thinking work is more important than family?" Alexander held her face between his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Eloise, you're going to be an incredible mother. You have more love, compassion, and strength in your pinky finger than most people have in their entire body." "But what if, he interrupted gently. "Sweetheart, we can spend our whole lives creating disaster scenarios, or we can trust that the love we feel for each other and our daughter will guide us through anything." "When did you get so wise?" she asked through her tears. "When I fell in love with a woman who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it," Alexander replied, kissing her forehead. "Now, let's go home. We have a nursery to finish decorating." That night, as Alexander assembled the crib they'd bought together, Eloise leaned against the doorframe watching him. His sleeves were rolled up. There was an expression of absolute concentration on his face, and occasionally he muttered instructions to himself, as if performing a particularly delicate surgery. "You're treating that crib like it's open-heart surgery," she observed, amused. "It's more important than open-heart surgery," he replied without looking up. "It's where our daughter will sleep." When he finished, Alexander stood up, putting an arm around Eloise's waist. Together they looked at the room they'd created. Soft yellow walls, the Star Mobile spinning gently above the white crib, a nursing chair in the corner where Eloise would spend countless hours with Isabella. "Ready?" he asked. "To be parents?" "Absolutely not," she admitted. "But ready to try to learn to love this child with everything we have?" "Yes." Alexander pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Then we're perfect for each other. Two terrified parents who will figure everything out along the way. Together," she added. "Always together," he agreed. And when Isabella kicked again, as if agreeing with her parents, they both laughed. A sound of pure joy that echoed through the room that would soon be filled with baby laughter, middle-of-the-night cries, and a love deeper than either had ever imagined possible. Dr. Heartbreaker had finally found his heart, and he was about to discover it was much bigger than he'd ever dreamed. Sometimes the most honest words are the ones we whisper without knowing someone is listening. Alexander Bennett discovered that behind his armor of coldness was a heart that was just waiting for permission to beat again. Eloise Carter learned that confronting the truth, even when it hurts, can open doors to a love that transforms not just 2 lives, but 3. Because in the end, maybe courage isn't about not being afraid. Maybe it's about choosing to love even when every fiber of our being screams at us to run. And you? Have you ever had the courage to break your own rules for love? If this story touched you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, where are you listening to this from? Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you stories like this.